Right. Now I'd like to move on now to our third speaker, who is from Iran. And so I'd like to spotlight Anan and bring him in so he can give us his story of political prisoners in Iran.
Pre the Islamic Republic coming to power in 1979, when the uprising took place in Iran, one of the main issues was the issue of freedom of speech and the freedom of association, two main topics that were, if you like, on the front of all of the protests. Throughout that uprising, the idea was to, first of all, stand against what Shah at the time was saying. What he was saying was that, for example, he said the idea of people who are Marxists in itself means that they are effectively people who are acting against the law. Marxism is against the law, and anybody who is Marxist is actually thinking about the current state, and therefore they are terrorists. And hence, anybody who has any idea of thinking about political prisoners in Iran, quote, he was saying that they are terrorists, effectively. And Shah used to go around and saying in Iran, we don't have any political prisoners, but we do have terrorists in prison. And that's where they ought to be. During the uprising, one of the main things that happened was breaking down all the gates of the prisons and freeing all political prisoners in Iran. Following the uprising, the pressure for the recognition of the freedom of speech was so much. Just to give you an example, was that the pressure from below, forcing even the Islamic Republic at the time to name one of the streets in Tehran as Bobby Sands, in recognition of the pressure that was from the masses for the recognition of the freedom of speech. And they had to even name the street as Bobby Sands Street, and as it still stands. Further on, as we came through, as the Islamic Republic managed to gain hold of the power, and again, continuation of what Shah could not do was suppression. And in response to that, we had larger scale of even private houses and dwellings being turned into prisons. And we ended up with a scenario that in the mid-80s, we had roughly estimates are around 95 to about 100,000 of people who were imprisoned, executed, in order to actually make sure that the Islamic Republic can stay in power. And that's how it stood in power, and through the mass suppression. Since that time, since the middle 80s until now, we had continued suppression and obviously continued imprisonment. In Iran, the right of any individual to be considered to be innocent unless proven guilty is not recognized. And the judicial process does not even recognize the right of anybody who is accused of anything to have the due process of the legal following of the courts in terms of having lawyers and representatives, even when they are actually forced, and the state has to accept that there has to be a representation on behalf of the accused. They actually ignore it, and the judge can actually make a decision as reference to the law that something has happened which is against the Islamic Republic, and as a result, one is imprisoned. So the issue of political prisoners in Iran is very much linked to what is generally, I think was mentioned earlier as well, with regard to the issue of recognition of labor and the general labor movement in Iran. The process of the growth of the or escalation of the protests that we saw in Iran under the banner of the Women, Life, Freedom, which started in September of last year and continued with mass protests in the streets, resulted in huge number of arrests. All of them are political prisoners, in addition to the already held political prisoners, and the state has decided not to call them political prisoners. They still call them in the same way as terrorist agents of abroad, and any opposition to the state is considered to be one that it is a crime, and as a result of the crime, therefore, it is imprisonment and very likely issues of long-term imprisonments or up to the issue of execution. in terms of the working class, the protests have nonetheless continued. Today in Iran, we have around about 100 different major production centers are on strike, and they all have got the threat of imprisonment in front of them. The protest movement that was taking place in Iran in terms of mass street actions resulted in the state deciding to arrest some, but more to try and actually avoid even the overcrowding of the prisons, to such an extent that they decided to go on a shoot on the street scenario. In terms of the overall action, I think one thing is major, which was mentioned throughout, I think, all of the speeches up to now, is the idea of not having political prisoners would only rely on the idea of recognition of the right to speech, right to assemble, right to protest. And the only issue here is that achievement of that can only be a result of the protest movement, which is mass, and a class struggle. It needs a state where there is no need to actually hold anybody because of their political opinion, and the more widespread acceptance of the right to speech and right to expression can only be achieved for a class that does not have any benefit in actually restricting that right, and that is the working class. So the issue of the release of the political prisoners, the issue of the freedom of speech, ability to be able to express oneself, to protest, and be able to actually be heard, to a large extent, is ever so much linked to the class struggle which is taking place in Iran. And as part of that, with thousands and tens of thousands of political prisoners in Iran, the main idea today is acceptance of this fact that the more the society is changing, the more that the class struggle is showing, is that there is only one class that has no benefit in restriction of the freedom of speech, and that's the working class. And as a result, the more benefit that is gained in this struggle is the more advance we would make towards achievement of a society free of political prisoners. This is in case of working people, in terms of the youth, in terms of students, in terms of journalists, everywhere. These issues are ever so much recognized. In Iran, for example, the arrest of Julian Assange, in terms of what he actually expressed, or what was expressed at the time, against all the hypocrisy, I think, of a large extent of the media that actually talks about freedom of information, but they're very happy to go silent when it comes to withholding somebody because of exposing of secrecy of the diplomacy that is taking place, has got huge root in Iran. Arrest of Assange was a major issue in Iran, and was one that many journalists actually talked about, and they themselves were later on arrested. Similarly, when it comes to the issue of understanding the rights of anybody to protest, means that as soon as the state gets them, effectively they call them as prisoners, but in reality they are political prisoners. And I think it's this acceptance that freedom of expression, ability to be able to gather, to protest, and ability to be free from the reins of the state is the precondition to be able to actually call an end to the whole issue of political prisoners. And in that regard, I feel ever so close to all the talks that have been given so far, that somebody who actually, as a teacher, as a student, as a working person, as an individual who decides not to accept the forceful dress code that the Islamic Republic wants to put, all of them are actually finding ways of expressing themselves and are effectively called political prisoners. And I think that is the main issue. Being able to actually have the democracy can only be achieved towards the situation of a struggle that is taking place to achieve the widest level of democracy. And that can only be done by a class that actually has no benefit in any restriction of the freedom of expression. If I leave it as that, I hope that should give you a sort of a brief background of what goes on in Iran. In terms of numbers and names, it's very difficult to give you names and numbers because they are not only widely known, but there are far too many. So I thought probably that gives you an idea.
That's very well done, and within time as well. Very well done. Yeah, that's shocking. You're talking about hundreds of thousands of prisoners, or tens of thousands.
Well, we have at the moment, the last time after the recent protest, the state announced that they freed 8,000 people during just the last 6 months of arrests.
Wow.
That was even with a large amount of bragging of the numbers, but in reality, the number of political prisoners in Iran are unknown. But everybody does know that there are tens of thousands of political prisoners in Iran. But the 100,000 that I mentioned was the number of people who were executed back in the middle of 1980s.
Wow, good heavens! So
probably I could add this to give you an expression in terms of the numbers. Currently, we have roughly between 6 to 8 million Iranians who have left Iran and are abroad. Considering the population in Iran now is about 80 million, we're talking close to 10% of the population having left the country. Again, just to give you another idea of this, in 1979, when the uprising took place in Iran, the population in Iran was 33 million. Now is 85 million. So huge amount of youth. Given the technology, access to internet, etc., these are the people who do not want to have that restriction and are very much familiar with what is expected in terms of the right of expression. So the numbers of those held are huge.
Mm-hmm. Gosh, shocking stuff. If anybody would like to ask a question or make a contribution, could you please raise your hand electronically? Or I'll try and see, a lot of people don't have their videos on now. Would anyone like to ask Anan a question or make a contribution at the moment? No, I think you've made your case extremely well. I don't think anyone's got any questions because you've actually explained it very, very well indeed. What I would like, Steve, hang on, Steve would like to ask a question. Steve.
Comment, and of course all these situations are different, and in the case of Julian, we're dealing with situations where individuals are being victimized in Julian's case, whereas in the case of Iran and Belarus, you're dealing with a sort of counter-revolution where hundreds and thousands of people are being arrested, aren't they, and put in jail. So they're kind of different situations, but they're obviously the same thing. They're just at different levels of struggle. It's the heightening of the struggle. The need in Iran to suppress the popular democratic movement in Iran has led to thousands being attacked and brutalized and locked up. And it's the same as well in Belarus, where it's the defeat of that movement that's led to these comrades being victims and locked up as well. So, they're all different kind of cases, and yet they've got one thing in common, that there's a common thread that connects them all together. And that's as you say, that is the struggle.
Absolutely. Ken has his hand up. Ken, I'm going to bring you in.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Alan. To what extent is there any kind of organized political opposition in Iran at the moment? I mean, the protest movement against hijab has been going for many, many months now, but from this side, there doesn't appear to be any organized political program behind it or any kind of party that's supporting those protests. Thank you.
Excellent question, Ken. Would you like to come in there and answer?
Yeah, sure. In terms of the political opposition, I think there is one thing given for a fact, and that is the end of, or death knell, if you like, of the Islamic Republic has been rang, and everybody can see it. Even the state authorities have already said, look, this situation cannot continue. That is given on one side. But in terms of the social movement, there are two main oppositions. One is opposition on the right, one is opposition on the left. The opposition on the right in this scenario is seeking a handover. They're hoping a repetition of what happened in 1979 over and above what people are asking for. Now, in that band of what I call right, there are many different groupings, organizations, and gatherings. Then you have also the other alternative, which is the alternative of the left, again, with all different strata, organizations, and groups. The opposition on the left is very much the one that has echoes within the society, and that has risen much more. And that opposition is the one that does not accept a handover from above and is seeking a change from below. There are a huge number of, if you like, different groups and sections that are participating in this part. The opposition on the left is seeking an alternative, and that is councils. Councils are very similar to the words of Soviets. Think of it in that respect. I'm not saying they are formed, they are there now, but a lot of them are clandestine, a lot of them are public. What they are actually seeking is the ability to be able to rule through direct representation. During the past 6 months, you noticed a lot of opposition from the right wing, especially because of the media support that they have, to give the impression as if this opposition is abroad outside Iran, and they are trying to show an alternative, similar to what Khomeini did back in 1979, to be acceptable and hand over from the top. The society has not accepted that. What the society is pushing for is formations of their own representative at local and workplaces. For example, in terms of the issues that we have seen even prior to this mass movement, was that of the COVID scenario. When COVID took place, Iran was one of those countries that initially the main ruler, Khamenei, said that the actual vaccinations like that of Pfizer, for example, these were made by the imperialists, and therefore they're not acceptable. And what masses did from the below was they actually themselves started to clean up the place, form support groups, help those who are actually held, provide help and assistance and care, and cleaning up of the municipalities, etc. They are taking place from below. And similarly, in the current term, is very similar. What started as the idea of what is just against compulsory dress code is more the case that in Iran today, you see large numbers of women, despite the fact that there is huge crackdown, they are going out and they're saying we dress as we want, and therefore they're not wearing any of the Islamic dress code. They haven't been able to push it back, and that is coming from below. This is the opposition that is gaining momentum, but the answer would really depend on who actually managed to form a scenario to actually change the situation. At the moment, the right wing doesn't have enough to be able to change. Honestly, the left is there, but they don't have enough muscle to actually change it either. So current now, what is happening is deepening of that division across the society. And that's what we're seeing more and more. The only place probably in the whole Middle East, Iran, is one of those that there is no need to think about exposure or revelations about the role of the state. The state doesn't have any support. That is obviously given. The question is who would have or who would be able to gain the upper hand to actually topple it down. And the status quo just shows huge and rising polarization in Iran. But it is watch this space, if you like. Let's see how it actually progresses. But this is what is happening. And I think this is perhaps the only country that does know something, that if we manage to extend this protest movement, if we manage to actually push back the Islamic Republic further, the impact of this, I don't think would be just seen across Middle East. I think there would be huge worldwide impact that we would see. And that is what is taking place. It is still going on and is still an ongoing progress.
Thank you. Thank you.
Goodness gracious me, that's really positive, actually. That's brilliant. So people are getting organized at a local level, at a community level.
Yeah, I mean, like for example, in terms of political prisoners, what we are seeing is now different groups are being formed of parents, families, and even neighbors of those who have been taken as political prisoners, and they are forming gatherings, they're forming their own groups, and they are protesting in front of prisons all the time. So this is something which is ongoing. And at the same time, the only support for this is obviously through not the right wing, but through the, if you like, the mass workers movement across. Like, for example, one of the trades associations of teachers. Their head is at the moment in prison. And we see huge protests coming and support coming from the education unions across the world, or similar for that of the bus workers. We're seeing it from the Trans-International Transport Workers support. This is ongoing. The support for this is also very similar coming from the left rather than the states of the West. The state of the West at the moment, they favor the Islamic Republic more than anything else.
Wow. So you are in the NEU, which is the biggest teaching union in the UK. Are the teaching unions in the UK supporting the teaching union in Iran?
Yeah, they have. Against Habibi, who was, for example, one of the members of the teachers associations, there have been many letters and protest letters sent across from unions in UK and internationally. It similarly has been happening from different places. But what I'm trying to stress is that what we look for, what we see as the part which is actually supporting this movement, is again not expected from the top, but is expecting from below and from the supporters. And I think that's the same experience probably that Assange is getting, the same scenario which Belarus is getting. It's coming from people who are actually recognize that they need the right of expression and the right of association and right of protest. It's very similar. It's that international connection, which I think is majorly important. So from that point of view, the idea that you talk about Republic, you talk about Labour, is very much linked to exactly what we're feeling. The scale is different, as Steve they say, but I think that the scale is dependent on the level of a struggle which is taking place and the level of pressure that the states feel.
Yes, it's exactly what we're talking about. You know, the pressure from below, people getting together in local communities and citizens' assemblies.
Absolutely.
Really, it's really encouraging to hear that that's happening in Iran. It's fantastic stuff. Okay, I think Paul, you had your hand up as well. No, not okay. Okay, so Paul had his hand up, but he's saying he's waving at me. No. Well, Steve's got his hand up again. Okay, I'll allow you, because you're the convener, I will allow you another intervention, Steve.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Carol. I'm just going to ask about, in terms of the bigger picture, you've got the Islamic Republic, and my argument would probably be that the argument is for a democratic republic, but it must be a secular republic. So I'm interested to know, given what you said is that the Islamic Republic has lost its credibility with the population, would secularism, the idea that you could have a democratic state that wasn't an Islamic state, would that have a majority support amongst the population, do you think, or will the Islamic idea still be the dominant one that still ties people into the old order, really, essentially?
I think probably what we have to look, as you said, in terms of the bigger picture, Iran traditionally was not Islamic society. Iran traditionally was very much a modern society by the terms even in 1979. The society has not accepted it. The fact that the Islamic Republic, just when the uprising took place in 1979, this was in February 1979, one of the biggest marches that took place immediately after, and that was on 8th of March. That was one of the biggest mass women's march which took place in Iran. And that was cracked down harshly by the Islamic State. The fact that the Islamic State has to make it a legislation has not come through the acceptance from below. It has come from the rule from above. For example, when we say about the issue of women in Iran, it's not the Islamism that is actually holding, but that's the tool that the state uses. Women in Iran have faced acid thrown on their face, held in terms of the employment laws. Women in Iran are not allowed to participate in every part of education they want to. A woman in Islamic State in Iran, across the same as all of the Islamic ideas, is not allowed to be a judge, is not allowed to become a prime minister. All of these are a state's ways of actually holding half of the population. And they have gone through huge amount of oppression in order to make that possible. Society doesn't accept it. What is happening now is all the time, of what we have seen over the past 4 decades, is that the force from above has actually enforced this to make it possible, rather than the other way around. What the picture that the Islamic Republic wants to portray is as if the society doesn't accept it. And I think that's the same of all the states. All the states say that it is in the benefit of the overall population. The same as talked about Assange. Assange exposed some secrets, and they said the society does not accept or does not agree with holding or exposing of the secrets. That's the picture they paint. But in terms of making that possible, if it was the case that the society was Islamic, and if the society did accept that, then there would have been no need for all these legislation, all the expense and all of the huge machinery that they have in institutions in order to enforce it. The fact that they have to do that means that the society doesn't want it. And just to add one last point on this, right now, in trying to take a vindication after the protest in Iran, what we have seen over the past 2 months has been the case that they have decided to start using chemical gases in girls' schools. A lot of secondary schools, girls' schools, have been forced a lot of girls have gone to hospitals. At the moment, several number have already died because they're using poisonous gas against the girls' schools. This is, again, continuation of the same thing that they did when they were going in. And what masses are doing is people themselves are actually standing up together. They're saying we stand and guard the schools to ensure that that is not done. The Teachers Association has said that if the situation does continue, they would actually form the classes outside the schools just to make sure that continues. And the state is going through all of this. And this is not in just 1 or 2 schools. It has happened in so many schools across the whole country. So it is a form of suppression, again, by the same way of trying to continue and push it back. In Afghanistan, they outlaw it. In Iran, they cannot outlaw it because the society won't accept it.
Wow. My goodness.
It's a lot of protests.
Yeah, I didn't realize that girls had actually died. I know
Yes, they have.
About the gassing. But
Yeah, they have done it. And the state says they can find somebody who is a spy from somewhere else in anywhere, but they cannot find those who are actually do the poisoning. And everybody does know state of faction of the state is already in it. And that's part of, it's another way of suppressing. And the protest that is taking place from below against this is so large a scale that the Islamic Republic has so far managed to say, oh, we found this person, we found that person, but everybody does know it is part of the whole state, and that's a form of suppression.
Wow. That's thank you so much for coming to talk to us. It's been, I think your story has been the most, as Jill said, the most positive. It's wonderful to hear that people in Iran are actually pushing back against the state and protecting these girls' schools and getting together. It's absolutely marvelous to hear this. So thank you so much.
Thank you.